My first step was to fit the seat clamp, seat post and saddle. To start with, you want to grease the inside of the seat clamp and also the bolt. Then, simply just push the seat clamp onto the seat tube. Before inserting the seat post, grease the inside of the seat tube so it doesn't scratch the seat post upon insertion. Then, make sure it is inserted past the minimum insertion point, which is shown on the seat post. Next, you want to slide the saddle into the mount on top of the seat post, and then play around with the two bolts until the saddle becomes at a good angle. By tightening the back bolts, it causes the angle of the saddle to rise upwards, and vice versa with the front bolt. Up next is fitting the bottom bracket. Firstly, grease the screw part of both sides of the bottom bracket. Then start to screw in the bottom bracket cups with your hand. Make sure that you are screwing it dead straight, and it will specify which way to twist the bottom bracket on the cup. Then use the bottom bracket tool to tighten the bracket all the way into the bike. Then moving on to the front of the drivetrain. Before sliding the front drivetrain through, apply grease to the core which slides through the bottom bracket. Then push it through. However, you may need to use a hammer to force it through the last bit. Once it is through the other side, then slot the other crank on at 180 degrees to the opposite crank. Then tighten the crank with an Allen key. Finally, tighten the bottom bracket cap using a set of needle pliers. Moving on to the headset, I have laid out the parts in the correct order. To begin with, place the crown race and lower head tube race on the fork, then insert through the frame. Then add the upper head tube race, the compression ring, the dust seal, and finally the spacers and stem. Then you need to mark this level with a pencil, as this is where you will then cut your forks down to. Once you have cut your forks down, you need to insert the star nut into the top of the fork tube. You do this using a hammer and screwdriver. Then you can put the headset back together, but it's important that you grease both the two head tube races. Finally, add the top cap and bolts back to the top. Up next is fitting the bars. When fitting the bars, you simply slide the handlebars through the stem. Then tighten with the 4 bolts. However, you must tighten these 4 bolts in a set pattern. To start, you tighten the bottom right, then the top left, then the top right, and then the bottom. Moving on to the rear derailleur, I greased up the screw part on the rear derailleur and started to thread it in. Before tightening, I ensured the small notch on the small derailleur fitted into the gap on the derailleur mount. This ensures the derailleur is in the correct position. I then tightened using an Allen key. Before moving on to the chain, I attached the chain guide to the down tube using the Allen key. When measuring the chain, I threaded it around the chain rings and through the derailleur and chain guide. It is important that the chain is on the largest chain ring at both the front and the back. Then you want to break the chain by removing the pin after 2 extra links once the chain ends cross. Once you have broken the chain, you want to rethread it around the drivetrain before placing the pin through the 2 links using the chain tool. Next, I attach the brake levers to the handlebars by just sliding them on and tightening them up with an Allen key. Then I routed the rear brake cable down the bike and then had to attach the caliper. To do this, I screwed in the adapter first and then the caliper into the adapter. I then attached the 2 gear levers onto the bike, and they went on the inside of the brake levers. The final step to complete the handlebars was to attach the grips. For this, I greased the inside of the grip to help it slide onto the handlebar easier. Once I slid them on and had them in the right place, I tightened them up with an Allen key. I then had to force the bar ends onto the end of the handlebars to stop the risk of the grips falling off. This just requires some force to push the bar ends in. To complete the brakes, I had to route the front brake down the forks. The cable goes through a small clip and then you have to attach the caliper onto the mount which is on the front fork. This then simply screws in. Now onto the gear cables. I started with the rear gear cable. To start with, I made sure the cable was fully taut in the lever by turning the nozzle all the way towards the bike. I then placed the cap and outer cable onto the inner cable and ran it all the way down the bike to the end point. I then marked this point and then cut the outer cable. It's worth noting when doing this measurement, you want to turn your bars in the opposite direction, as that is when the cable will need to be at its longest. This way you know you will always have enough cable. I gave myself a little extra cable than required because if you cut too short, you will need a new cable. Once the cable was cut, I put a second cap on the end of the outer cable and slotted it into the rear derailleur. After this, I pulled the inner cable tight and wrapped it around the screw to finish it off. I cut the excess inner cable and put a small case on the end so the wire doesn't fray. To complete the gears, I then moved on to the front gear cable. This was an identical process as for the rear gear cable. When fitting the tyres to the rims, you want to get one side of the tyre on the inside of the rim, all the way around. You then want to put a bit of air into the inner tube just so that it holds a bit of its shape. Then you want to put the inner tube inside the tyre. To do this, start at the valve, and when you put the valve through the rim, you can then work your way around the tyre until the whole inner tube is inside. Then pump up the tyre to about 25 psi, and this will push the tyre out the edge of the rim. Next up is to fit the front brake disc. Firstly, make sure all the pins are an equal height and then slide the centre lock onto the wheel. Then place the locking mechanism on. That is the disc then fitted. So now just attach the front wheel using the axle. Finally, you fit the pedals. This is very easy. It will specify on the pedal whether it is a right or the left. Then use an Allen key to tighten. A tip when tightening is you will turn the Allen key towards the front of the bike. Now your bike is complete, and this is the final result.